Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
What does it mean to think planetarily? In an era defined by cascading crises, climate change, pandemics, and biodiversity loss, it's clear that the systems we rely on to govern our world are struggling to keep up. Joining us today are Jonathan Blake and Nils Gilman, authors of Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. Their book challenges us to move beyond the frameworks of globalization and embrace the concept of the planetary, a bold reimagining of how we address interconnected challenges that transcend borders. Drawing on insights from systems science, philosophy, and global governance, we explore why our existing institutions fall short and how planetary thinking offers a path forward. From the failures of pandemic response to the ecological disruptions of the Anthropocene, it's a fascinating and timely discussion about what's wrong, what's possible, and why rethinking the way we organize ourselves is an imperative for our time.
That fundamental realization that we call the condition of planetarity suggests, in fact, demands, in our opinion, that we fundamentally develop new institutions to govern our behavior so that we can actually have a habitable and sustainable relationship with the one planet that we live on.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Jonathan Blake is the Associate Director of Programs, and Nils Gilman the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President at the Berggren Institute. We hosted this dialogue in October 2024. Okay, so we're here to talk about your recent book, Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises, published by Stanford University Press. So certainly I think the idea of planetary has been circulating for quite some time in, say, scientific circles, in specific kind of group cosmologies, but it's suddenly gained a lot of traction. Not only kind of in societal awareness, debates, but also in the political discourse, including my own field of global governance research. So I think what we can say at the moment is that this shift hasn't really resulted in any new arrangements when it comes to political ordering, but it has sparked a really serious examination of existing models of political order, and indeed the values, the priorities that those models embed. I noted that on the book cover, Kim Stanley Robinson, the acclaimed science fiction author, said the book fills an urgent need of our time. And I definitely agree. I mean, it's one of the, I'd say, boldest, most clear-eyed scholarly diagnoses of what's wrong and what it is that needs to be done. So before, though, we get into the planetary thinking as an idea whose time perhaps has finally arrived, perhaps you could share a bit about the book's origins. So where did the idea come from? How long was it in the making?
Yeah, well, first of all, Tom, thank you so much for having us on the podcast. We're really honored to be here. I'll start by answering that question that, to some extent, I think all of us have been aware of planetary, what we describe in the book as planetary issues for some time. Anybody who's been paying attention to Earth system science or systems biology is aware that this term has taken on some currency in those fields. But I think the immediate origin or point of departure spur for us to write this book was the pandemic. I remember having a conversation with Jonathan in the summer and fall of 2020, and we were looking around what was happening in the world and the abject failure of the systems of global governance to effectively address the pandemic. And we were asking ourselves, why is this? And I think that was really the immediate spur for writing the book. And then over the course of the fall, we put together a book proposal, and we started writing it in January of 2021. So that's the sort of short story about it. I think the larger story that I would suggest is that I think you're absolutely right to say that these ideas have been percolating around in various scientific fields for some time, But I think there is a kind of a breakthrough moment that's happening right now into these ideas and how we should think about governance differently. And I think the pandemic has spurred us, and I think it's a spur to many people. But I think there's a larger set of concerns that people are thinking about. There's also a sense that the globalization has kind of run its course, and that we need a new kind of vocabulary and language to think about how do we govern the kinds of challenges which we're going to face in the coming decades, which is going to require a very different set of institutional responses than the kinds of governance arrangements we made to deal with the challenges of globalization. I'll let John talk a little bit more to the distinction between planetary and global as we use it in the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one more note on the kind of the deeper history, and then two notes on kind of like what really sparked it off at the time. So first, I mean, the deeper history that Nils and I have known each other for about 15 years now. I was originally his student in a seminar he taught in my last semester at university on something called deviant globalization, which looked at kind of like the dark underbelly of the process of global integration. So this is things like where globalization is the story typically told about, at that time, at least, by Thomas Friedman and others, the wonderful movement of ideas and capital and how great it is that we can, have folks in India answering phone calls to tell us, how to solve our, tech problems or something. But this class really focused on like, well, at the same time you have diseases that move. You have people moving to like cure their diseases by medical tourism, going to like get an organ transplant in Nepal because it's way cheaper, and to just pay a peasant essentially to sell their organs in ways that you can't do in the West. So, and guns and drugs and all this. So this is something we've been thinking about a long time, that the way in which the global governance system has these gaps, has these jurisdictional kind of underlaps where it can't kind of regulate everything that's flowing. And so you come to this realization amidst the pandemic, amidst kind of the ever-growing crisis of climate change, one that we in California, have come to know as regular fires, the sky, turning all sorts of bizarre colors. And it was clear that, we have no ability to govern this. California has fairly strict climate regulations, but like the governor can do as much as they want. And, we're still impacted by the flows of carbon in the atmosphere that like really, we just can't work on our own. So that's the deeper story. I want to tag two things in the kind of more specific, like what was going on in kind of 2020 that made this book really jump out. So one was an experience that I had during the pandemic. I was in a Japanese grocery store that was right by my where I lived at the time, and was waiting in line. We were all wearing masks, had to stand 6 feet apart, and as a result, the line went into aisles that I normally didn't just like stand around. I was standing there again, separated from other people, masked up, and I looked next to where I was standing, and there was a can of tomatoes that was in Japanese, but then had like a sticker in English on it. And basically, it was Italian tomatoes. It said grown in Italy. They'd been then flown to Japan, where they were put in a can, labeled, at which point they were at some point flown to the United States so they could be sold in a Japanese grocery store as Japanese Italian packed tomatoes. And I was just thinking, I'm like, this is insane. Like, here we are, like, I was standing next to this, perfect product of globalization where, basically the extreme, it's so extremely cheap to ship things that like it made economic sense for these tomatoes to travel around the world and back to sit in the shelf in Los Angeles. At the very same time, here I am wearing a mask, separated from people. Like, and it was just this bizarre moment. I was already starting to work on the book, and I just kind of crystallized. I'm like, okay, here's the global here on the shelf, and here's the planetary here, with the mask and being kind of fearful. This is pretty early days. We didn't know anything, but fearful of this, invisible microbe that could be floating through the air. At that time, maybe we even thought it was like, you had to, could be like on items. So at the same time, I was starting to read the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's the kind of eminent historian at the University of Chicago, who makes an argument in a 2019 article that on the distinction between the global and the planet that I was like experiencing at that moment, where he says that the global of globalization is not the same as the global of global warming, and that we've made a mistake in part because this linguistic connection, right? So we think, okay, global warming, globalization, this is the same thing. But he makes the point that these are actually totally separate concepts that just happen to be, we're using the same term. So the global globalization is precisely that process of human-driven integration that leads those tomatoes, coming out of the soil in Italy to then be shipped to Japan, shipped to Los Angeles, so they could be sold for like $2 or whatever. Like this was like in LA. So that's globalization. It's this story of humanity kind of integrating the globe for its own purposes. But at the same time, the global of global warming is a totally different story. One that is not about human intention, but things that continue to flow around the world. So you still have this scale issue, that we're talking about kind of the whole Earth as a geographic scale. But instead of human intentionality, these are things like viruses, like carbon compounds in the atmosphere, like other species, like things flowing through the oceans, that human intentions are not part of the story really at all, other than we're affected by them. And he then kind of clarifies that the global of globalization is, we could still call the global, but in order to distinguish it from the global of global warming, we should be, thinking of that really as the planetary, because that story is about our embeddedness in planet Earth. It's about our connections in and among the atmosphere, the biosphere, and all these other kind of systems and cycles that enable us to live, enable us to have the global. So those kind of two experiences, I guess, kind of early in 2020, really just crystallized for me that this is something new, at least conceptually, and that it's worth distinguishing between the two. And as a result, and I think, obviously what brings us to talking to you all at the, Global Governance Futures podcast is that, like, well, right now we have something called global governance, but once we start realizing that the global of globalization, which maybe global governance is totally fine for, but then we also have this global of global warming that we start to think, well, wait a minute, that's now the planetary. We have global governance for planetary issues. Something's maybe not lining up, and that, I think, gets us back and to understanding like why we have kind of these proliferating problems that we seem unable to deal with, because institutions that were set up for one problem are now trying to be used for other ones, and there's this mismatch that it's a big problem.
Super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, this contrast between tinned tomatoes and, say, the acidification of the ocean, it's a very clear-cut distinction that is actually very helpful. And I think the gestation of your book has some affinities with the podcast, actually. We also came out of the COVID situation. It was kind of a refuge amidst all of the crisis. And then, of course, at a more macro scale, the other sort of the extension of our title is Global Governance Futures, Imperfect Utopias. And we're sort of looking out there, and a lot of the structures seem to be dysfunctional, broken, trying to get to the bottom of interrogating what might be the source to that crisis we see in global governance. And indeed, just recently we interviewed Jonathan Rosen and Craig Murphy on the meta crisis, which also provides another context, I think, for this conversation. But yeah, so it was great to hear sort of the lineage of, say, the planetary and where you picked up that idea. But I've really rarely seen a distillation of or application of planetary thinking as clear as in this book. So you have this concept of planetary thinking. You suggest that we need to think in terms of this context of planetarity, I think is the terminology you use. And as you've implied, when we look at the structures that we associate with international multilateralism or global governance, it seems as if what you're saying is that they are premised on an incorrect contextualization, that the contextualization itself is outdated, and this is producing all sorts of morbid symptoms, to say riff on Gramsci. So perhaps you could just walk us through what is the real value of thinking in terms of the planetary or planetarity, in terms of the empirical approach that it provides us.
Well, let me start out by saying planetarity is fundamentally about our deeply imbricated and interdigitated and entangled relationship with all sorts of different kinds of systems, biogeochemical systems across the planet. And we can't get away from any of that. What we realize increasingly is that because of the affordances of science, and this goes to astrobiology, I mentioned earth system science and systems biology also, there's a whole bunch of different fields in science that are all focused on the way in which we're embedded in a whole series of systems and systems of systems, and that we can't fundamentally escape any of those things. And understanding what that means for the human condition is what we refer to as the condition of planetarity. And understanding that we can't think of ourselves in these classic Enlightenment ways as being apart from, above, or separate from nature and natural systems. We are ineluctably, embedded in these systems. The issue is that the political institutions that we have built across the world, and particularly in the last 100 years, but really over the last several thousand years, have been resolutely anthropocentric and focused fundamentally on allowing human beings to negotiate their interests with one another. That's what national institutions are meant to do. National governance institutions are meant to do within a particular polity. It's also what the multilateral member state system is meant to do between nations. But it's absolutely focused on adjudicating interests of humans in one way or another. Now, some of these systems obviously historically have been more democratic, some have been more tyrannical, but they've all historically been about getting human beings to negotiate with each other. They've almost never been, insofar as they've treated nature in any particular way at all, is tended to treat nature as a kind of standing reserve of resources to harvest for human benefit, or as perhaps as a sink to dump human waste products, right? And the idea was that nature was sort of endlessly self-regenerating. What we realized in the era of the Anthropocene is, of course, that's not true. We're fundamentally perturbing all sorts of systems, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the biodiversity of the planet. We're polluting the atmosphere with space junk and various other kinds of chemical systems. So there's all sorts of things that we are in the process of disrupting that are the systems that we rely on in order to be able to thrive. And so that fundamental realization that we call the condition of planetarity suggests, in fact, demands, in our opinion, that we fundamentally develop new institutions to govern our behavior so that we can actually have a habitable and sustainable relationship with the one planet that we live on.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm also curious to ask, based upon some of the feedback from students, we think about the planetary in the context of the environmental crisis, principally. But I'm wondering what would be the relevance of this framing to, say, more long-standing old problems, such as, say, the security dilemma, which obviously is a key focus for a lot of international relations scholarship. Does this sort of interface with the debates we're familiar with from the 1990s around human security, or is that anthropocentric? Is that sort of rooted in an anachronistic framing? Is that compatible with planetarity?
So, the first kind of point is that the global and the planetary are not the same. And that's important because, I think some people misread our work as to say, well, the global should just be erased and replaced by the planetary. And that's an argument for some things. for things like climate change, pandemics, but that's for things like security, that still remains very much a global issue. Trade remains a global issue. Now, there are planetary aspects of this that we think we kind of should be, rethinking how we do that. But like kind of the structures of the UN that deal with, I don't know, like UNESCO, for example, that deal with education and culture and stuff like that. Like, I mean, those remain perfectly global. So it's not so global is not a pejorative term that we say like, okay, forget that. The new thing is planetary. That's not it. So, excuse me. So some of these longstanding concerns in global governance should remain the purview of global governance, and that's good. It's that there should be basically parallel institutions that could deal with the planetary, and of course there will be disagreements between them that will have to be adjudicated in various ways, and we'd have to like think through, well, how do we decide exactly where the boundary of trade, for example, which in some sense is about negotiating the flows, human intentioned flows between countries, but many of them have planetary implications of what they're trading, how it's being traded, where it's being harvested, et cetera. So it does change things, but something like security is a really good question, and that's something that I kind of hope to spend more time thinking about in the next coming year, is about the what a planetary security could mean and look like, what sort of our security infrastructure could mean, because I think we haven't yet come to grips with what it means, like the impact of, say, the energy transition is having on our conceptions of security, which for so long have really at a fundamental been based around like carbon, about fossil fuels. And I think a lot of it is baked into our assumptions. It's baked into our institutional design. It's based, in ways that we just haven't really thought through. So that's so the answer. So hopefully I'll have a better answer in a year or so. Like what a planetary inflected Security Council could be and could mean in a world that's kind of post fossil fuels. Anyway, that's to say, we have a lot of more thinking to do. So if any of your students are looking for a thesis or something, I highly recommend taking on this topic.
John, can I add something?
Yeah, please.
What I would I think first of all, it's a great question, Tom. The question of how this interfaces with traditional security concerns. That question is part of also what motivated me personally to want to write this book. I was involved in an earlier part of my career. I spent 7 or 8 years working in a consultancy where a lot of our clients were in the U.S. security establishment. And my shop wrote a paper that became somewhat notorious in the mid-aughts, about 20 years ago, where we wrote a paper on spec for a client at the Department of Defense in Washington, trying to imagine what the security implications of climate change could be. And it became a bit of a brouhaha because at the time the Bush administration was denying that climate change was happening, and yet the DoD commissioned this paper and it leaked and so on. But the reason why I was enthusiastic at the time about the idea that we might try to securitize, quote unquote, the issue of climate change is I thought at the time, 20 years ago, that if we treated climate as a security emergency, that would galvanize attention and action around the issue. That people would say, oh my God, sea levels are going to rise. There's going to be mass migration. It's going to cause governments to fall. If those things happen, that'll be a national security disaster. Therefore, we have to prevent those things from happening. That was a sort of idea we had by like trying to turn climate change frame it as a security matter. That's not what ended up happening, though. What ended up happening, and this actually goes to the heart of our argument about what's wrong with our current governance systems, is the DoD took that information and used it to just justify bigger budgets for themselves to rebuild naval bases that are, around the world that are at threat of flooding, to think about how do we, harden our forces so that they can fight under, more humid or more hot or more vector-borne disease-ridden areas and so on. They didn't actually, at the end of the day, the DoD thinks about national defense of the United States, or perhaps about the imperial suzerainty of the United States around the world. But it doesn't think about, like, actually we have to go to mitigate the underlying problem. And you can actually see that even in the current Biden administration guidance around climate change for federal agencies, right? Federal agencies are required to have, every federal agency currently is required to have a plan to move towards carbon emissions reduction, with one exception, which is the Department of Defense, which produces 75% of the federal emissions, right? So they do a carve out for themselves on the one thing that really matters, and that's because they're still thinking of this in terms of national terms. Like, how do we think about this as a national, individually American problem, right? They're not thinking about it as a planetary problem. They're still thinking about it as a global problem with national security implications. And so that experience I had, the disappointment, the frankly naivete that I had about trying to push the issue of climate change in a direction that would galvanize action, fell apart because it ran into the institutional reality of our national institutions being focused on the national interest rather than on the planetary interest or on the conditions of planetarity and trying to maintain those in a reasonable way. So that actually became a kind of a synecdoche for me, and then in conversation with John as we were developing the book, to understand what the fundamental problem we have globally, and by globally I mean in every particular nation state and also in the institutions that are designed to have nation states work together, or to actually, in fact, compete with one another in a rules-based manner. These institutions are just fundamentally not set up to deal with the national challenges. The multilateral member state institutions are there to help national states come together and in a, at least in principle, in a negotiated, jaw rather than war way, settle their differences in terms of their own national interests. None of them are set up, with a few very small exceptions that we could get into, to actually address the underlying planetary risks.
It's always great to hear those anecdotes. That sounds like that was a teaching moment there, Nils, for you. And yeah, fascinating insight into the realities of the 2000s when the US administration was still denying that climate change was happening. I think it also raises, very important questions around ethics. Obviously, within the security domain, we might ask the question, security for whom? But I'm going to hand over to Kat now, who has a question along these lines. So, Kat, please.
Hi, yeah. So I just wanted to ask more about the ethical dimensions that surround what you've written, particularly this sort of interrogation of human exceptionalism. That opens up to this vision of kind of this realignment with indigenous epistemology, which is introduced very early on in your book, where you say that Western science has taken a detour, misguided by a belief in human exceptionalism, but now possibly finds itself realigning with indigenous epistemology. So I explored a similar idea in my undergraduate, and I wrote and researched on this idea of an ontological turn in environmental governance, which basically involves rethinking our basic assumptions about reality. So, including our ontological commitments and our epistemological frameworks within governing structures. So this sort of boiled down to pluralizing knowledge, pluralizing epistemology, and sort of embracing this knowledge co-production within lots of different epistemic communities. And with this in mind, you explicitly state this need for more well-designed participatory methods of governance that allow for this pluralization, particularly of indigenous and national tradition. So I find myself in complete agreement with that, but I would also say that sometimes I find myself a bit disheartened or maybe disenchanted by this sort of idea, because we live currently in a governing society where there's just this continuous expansion of technocratic knowledge systems. And I guess it's these technocratic knowledge systems that sort of sidelines this other framework of thinking. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, you say that indigenous epistemology is an epistemology of the future, but I struggle to reconcile this given how deeply entrenched our current governing systems are within the technocratic frameworks. And so I just wanted your thoughts on whether you think this pluralization of epistemology is actually viable or really possible, or if you at all think that we're still at risk of replicating these existing power dynamics, even when we try to integrate this indigenous epistemology, or perhaps just different epistemologies and ontologies. Yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, so first of all, yeah, I mean, yes, we are always at risk of this. I mean, these, power is power and works in ways that we, see it play out all the time. So for sure, that risk still exists. The argument we make, I think, opens up the possibility of kind of expansions towards more plural knowledges in a couple different ways. First of all, moving beyond like what social scientists kind of condemn as methodological nationalism, already opens us up to think beyond the nation state as kind of like the end all be all and kind of like the definer of categories in ways that could be really helpful. That because once you start thinking about, say, governing a biome as opposed to the territory of a nation state, it already kind of puts you in mind of other ways of governing. So if you were to think, for example, of the Amazon as kind of an integrated ecological whole, as opposed to the sovereign territory of mainly Brazil, but also Ecuador and Peru and Colombia, etc. That's already put you in a different state of mind, to say nothing of like with different interests, with different possibilities. So that's one point. The other point, and we haven't really gotten yet in the interview to our central argument, but I can bring it up right now, which is we argue that in the response that we think makes sense to this condition of planetarity, to this recognition of, on the one hand, this inescapable connection and entanglement with the Earth's biogeochemical processes, but on the other hand, we can't forget that there are 8 billion human beings living on this planet, and who all have different desires, different needs. We can't pretend that there's one top-down solution that you can impose that'll satisfy everyone, that will like not lead to massive civil war, global global civil war, et cetera, et cetera. So what we argue is that we should be diffusing power kind of throughout the whole system. So we've been talking about our kind of idea of planetary institutions, that there should be some governance institutions that kind of have the remit for the whole planet, that are able to kind of dictate, or maybe that's the word I shouldn't use, push for planetary solutions that really have the interests of the planet as a whole, and not, as Nils was just talking about, the interests of the specific nation states in mind. But that's not the whole system that we're imagining. And in particular, we don't see that. We see these as narrowly constructed, narrowly focused institutions, like that would focus on a particular planetary problem. The ones that we turn to in the book are climate change and pandemics, but they would only really be at the high level. Then you would have other layers in this multi-level, multi-scalar governance system. For example, nation states could still play a role, but then we put a lot more emphasis on local governance, whether it's at the city level, the regional level, for some issues, perhaps even the neighborhood level. We want to be able to empower people in the places where they live to be able to, reach democratic answers closer to the people, essentially. In part because that's a way to respond to local planetary, the manifestation, the local manifestations of planetary challenges. So climate change isn't just one thing, right? Even though we often focus on the headline global average temperature, nowhere on Earth actually experiences that global average, right? The 1.1 degrees that we're at now manifests very differently in the Arctic than it does in the tropics. Even within, where we are in the United States, where Nils is in New York and I am in Los Angeles, plays out very differently. To say nothing of, what's going on like in Florida with, this ramped up hurricane season. So by in some sense pushing some amounts of power up to planetary institutions because of this recognition that the only scale at which planetary problems can be resolved is the planetary, but then also empowering local institutions to be able to do what makes sense and what is desired for the local population in their context, now opens up possibilities for much pluralizing epistemologies and ontologies, right? That now, rather than kind of being secondary actors within the nation state system, localities can have a much more of a stronger role that they can play in developing ideas and solutions that work for the people. So in the system that we're imagining, again, like the local, the national, and the planetary are much more horizontally structured rather than vertically, right? So this isn't like the way we have it now, is that things are, national capitals, have laws that overrule local governments and stuff. Really, the local government in our system would be have a lot more autonomies and power than they do now. So I'm not saying that like, oh, don't worry, like people can have, use their epistemologies at the local level, right? Which is today would kind of be like, okay, well, you get the scraps. In this system, that would be actually quite a powerful tool to be able to live that way. And it recognizes that in pluralizing epistemologies, it's for plural populations, what works for one group wouldn't work for another. That if you have some sort of a tradition of understanding the earth in a certain way, that doesn't mean that people in the next valley over, to say nothing of 5,000 miles away, have the same. But those people could then implement, as long as it's within the planetary boundaries that have been set by planetary institutions. So it's a very long-winded answer for what's a very good question.
Let me just add. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Katya.
No, you carry on, and then I can wrap it
Yeah,
up.
let me just say I also agree with John. It's an excellent question, and it's a vexing one because one of the things that we've struggled with in terms of epistemology, but also the ethics of the epistemology, is that how do you balance the pluralism of epistemology with the reality that there are certain things that are universal? And the question of universalism, I think, haunts this text to a certain extent. And not just the text, but the problem itself. I would believe that there are certain things that we can say in the way that science, Western technoscience, allows us to say, are provisionally universally true, such as when you pump a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, over time, it will lead to global warming. That's not an epistemologically relativist statement. I think that that's true whether you are an indigenous person in South America, or you are a Chinese, or you are a Brit, or whatever. That's a universally true statement. What to do about it, however, is certainly not, there is no universal truth about that. And this is where I think that there are a variety of different traditions, some of which we nod to in the book. We don't go into them in depth, and it could be a whole other book that would be about talking about the Southern African concept of Ubuntu, or the South American concept of buen vivir, or the Rwandan concept of agacio as self-worth, or the Chinese concept of tiansha. All of these are knowledge traditions and epistemological traditions that I think there are things to learn from that may be useful both universally and for certain in particular local contexts, in terms of thinking about how do we balance various trade-offs, because ultimately there are going to be trade-offs that we have to confront in terms of any kind of mitigation and especially adaptation strategies that particular localities are going to have to deal with to think about climate change, biodiversity preservation, et cetera.
Yeah, so I guess in essence, it's just about not necessarily essentializing any forms of governance, but that this application of knowledge co-production is basically a collective endeavor. It merges all sorts of knowledge or all sorts of sources of knowledges to define and also tackle specific issues that don't have a universal response. So there's like practical solutions on the local and on the global level, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, just to go one degree more into detail of what we propose in the book, what we believe should be happening in these planetary scale institutions is essentially two things. First of all, they're narrowly tailored. They're not a world government, as John was saying earlier. But what they should do is two things. One is invest and support the production of more relevant knowledge on the particular topic. So, figuring out ways to do syndromic surveillance of emergent zoonotic diseases, right? And knowledges that are required to do rapid genetic testing or perhaps vaccine development. For example, if we're talking about pandemic risk, or maintaining, if we're talking about climate change, building more computer models that can simulate what the likely risk factors are for floods in various places as we get a hotter and more moist atmosphere all over the world. These are the kinds of things that can happen in a kind of centralized way. The second thing that these institutions should do is push down proposed mitigation targets to nation states that then will, in many cases, should, we argue, push the actual implementation details down even further to localities, right? So the example that John gave of the difference between the kind of climate change challenges that New York and Los Angeles, where the two of us are sitting today, are facing are very different, right? New York faces flooding issues, hurricane, rising sea levels. Los Angeles, it's heat waves and fires and droughts. So very, very different impacts of climate change. There's no reason why Washington, D.C. or some planetary scale institutions should be telling either New York or Los Angeles how we should deal with climate change adaptation. What they can do, though, is say, hey, we need to have a carbon reduction, production off ramp, and that here are the carbon budgets that individual nationalities need to have as targets. And then those individual countries can figure out, do we want to get there by rolling out solar panels, producing more nuclear energy, reducing the more rapid transition of the ground transportation fleet to electricity as opposed to internal combustion engines. I mean, the way a particular area wants to do that is going to be particular to the local affordances and the economic circumstances and the political preferences of the people and the creatures that are there.
Right. Okay. So lots of threads there to I think to follow. Let's perhaps turn to the implementation challenge and get more into that area. So I think it is very commendable in the book. You take on the potential objections here, and I quote: "Why would national leaders give up power, and won't nationalism get in the way?" And you seek to address these very clear challenges head on, and it is instructive, I think, that you write national states should become administrators of planetary directives. So what we're talking about is not the dissolution of the national state structure necessarily, but in a sense, the reconfiguration or reformulation of that structure to pursue directives in a planetary context, perhaps sort of drawing on insights from, say, Elinor Ostrom's work around polycentricity, this kind of notion of meta-governance. And then you have this subsidiarity that moves down through the levels to the appropriate level, which, within that framework would be the most, in most circumstances, the most local level of political organization. So this raises a host of very interesting questions. And I know Arya's got one for you. So please, Arya.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Program. And in your book, you have discussed the challenge of scale and especially the practicality of what you call planetary subsidiarity. So how would local authorities to be supervised in this new governing architecture, especially to govern this, to guarantee these actions could be implemented at a relative well level? Thank you.
Yeah, let me talk about two different aspects of this, Aria. This is a great question, and I'm not sure we have all the answers worked out. I mean, the last couple pages of the book, we list out a whole series of unanswered questions that our framework opens up, and I think you're putting your finger on one of them. But let me say a couple of things. First of all, let me talk to what Tom was saying about the challenge of the national as the administrators. One thing that I think, again, our work has sometimes been interpreted as is that we want to get rid of nation states. That's not true. What we do want to challenge is absolute concepts of sovereignty, and that nation states have total independence from any kind of responsibility to deal with planetary issues. Why would governments give up power in this way, even in a segmented way, give up a slice of their sovereignty? I think there's basically two reasons why we think this is viable. And there are examples of this having happened, right? The first reason is governments will realize they cannot deal with some of these issues on their own. No single country, can unilaterally solve the climate change problem. No single country by itself can defend itself if a global pandemic, as we all saw, if a global pandemic breaks out. You can't just close your borders and protect yourself. No matter how much you try to close off, you're still the virus doesn't respect the borders, even if you try to shut human traffic across those borders. These viruses find a way. So if you can't solve a problem, you don't want to be held responsible for trying to solve the problem. And so national governments may realize that, and political leaders may realize that giving up a certain amount of sovereignty to agencies that are able to actually address the challenges is something that they would want to do. And I'll give a specific example of a case where that happened, which is in fact a kind of proto-planetary institution. And that's the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the International Atomic Energy Agency was originally set up in the late 1950s to help administer the civilian production of nuclear power around the world. And it was only in 1962 that it was, or after 1962, that it was granted a really different set of powers and authorities, namely to do deep inspections into the nuclear facilities of countries that have nuclear power production in order to prevent nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons proliferation. Nuclear facilities are dual use in the sense that they can be used to produce energy, but they can also be repurposed to produce fuel for nuclear weapons. And if you think about the fact that the IAEA has, by statute, the right to go in and inspect nuclear facilities all over the world, really at the drop of a hat. Anytime the inspectors from Vienna, and this is a technocratic thing for sure, want to go look at a nuclear facility, they have the right to do so. That's a pretty blatant violation of the sovereignty of these countries, is that you have these, international technocrats based in Vienna can sort of drop into your country and say, hey, we want to inspect your nuclear facility right now. Why would nation states be willing to give that up? And the reason why I fixated on the date 1962 is that's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis famously is the moment where the world came closest to a sort of a global nuclear war, which would have been obviously a national and political calamity, but it also would have been a planetary calamity in our sense, in the sense that, a global thermonuclear war would be massively catastrophic for the biosphere, right? And the prospect of almost coming to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe concentrated the minds of people in Washington and in Moscow to say, hey, we need to prevent proliferation. We need to prevent this from happening. And we're willing to give up even slices of our own sovereignty in order to protect ourselves from the prospect of this kind of planetary scale calamity. And giving up a small slice of our sovereignty is worthwhile to protect ourselves from this potentially planetary scale catastrophe, which any one of us individually can't solve on our own simply through deterrence. So that's an example of how the prospect of a really calamitous event could be the thing that would spur the change that we're talking about. And Tom, you mentioned up front that we have a quote on the cover of our book, a blurb from Kim Stanley Robinson. the reason why we asked him for one is that this is exactly the kind of scenario that he imagines at the start of his novel, Ministry for the Future, which he published 3 years ago now, I think. And he imagines that there's a heat wave that, this is the opening, there's no spoiler here, this is the opening chapter of the book. There's a heat wave that is so severe that it kills tens of millions of people in North India in a matter of a few weeks. And this is such a calamity for India that India's initial response is a national one. That they say, we're going to do unilateral geoengineering to prevent further global warming. And that prospect of an individual nation doing something individually then sets off the plot that eventually leads to the creation of a kind of planetary agency similar to the one that, similar in vibe to the kind of thing that John and I describe in our book. So I do think that there's this way in which the national can take over, rather the national leaders can find a reason why they would want to do this. It's not just science fiction, it's the prospect of a hanging. It concentrates the mind. And I think that that's the key point. Now, then, Arya, in response to your question about, the local implementation of these things, this goes back to the answer I tried to touch on earlier, which is that we believe that the local actors understand both the preferences and the limitations of what they can do better than higher level actors can. And decisions are more legitimate and they're likely to be more effective if they're done locally. But I think the question you were getting at was also an important one, which is what happens if they don't, if they're ineffective at doing this? And this is a larger issue which we don't have a complete answer to. And that is one of the biggest challenges with governance in general is that many parts of the world are undergoverned on a host of different topics. And we don't pretend we have an answer to that. I think we do have a potential answer to what do we do if people are intentionally defecting? If there's simply lack of government capacity to do enforcement, then it's really difficult to manage those situations. It may be that there needs to be help, right? Like one of the great planetary success stories was the eradication of smallpox. And the reason why that was so challenging was that the last pockets of smallpox, which were in places like Afghanistan and Somalia in the late 1970s, were places that had very low governmental capacity and very poor healthcare systems. And so people from the World Health Organization had to go out and from a central point, provide the ability to give smallpox vaccinations, even in these really remote corners. So there may need to be technology transfers and expertise transfers to places that are undergoverned in order for the implementation of these details, the implementation of various kinds of governance to be able to be done effectively. The last part of your question, there's a second part, which is what if there's intentional defectors? What do we do if Brazil elects a quasi-fascist person who decides he wants to burn down the Amazon, which is the patrimony of the entire planet, right? And he decides to do that unilaterally. This is not actually a hypothetical. This was just happening a couple of years ago. How would the world respond to that? And I do think we have mechanisms for dealing with that. There are sanctions regimes and other kinds of mechanisms that can push people to, push governments that are being reluctant to implement these things. And I don't know that those are going to be entirely effective in every case. They probably won't be. But if the motivation for chopping down the rainforest is financial penalties can't disincentivize people from doing that. The last point I would make on this, however, is that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Every kind of system of governance we've ever had has defectors and has, things it doesn't accomplish. No matter how much policing we have in any society, there are still people who will commit murders. That's not to say that policing is always bad, or that the fact that some murders continue to take place means we shouldn't have any policing at all, right? So there will be defectors. They can be deterred. There's not going to be perfect deterrence, but we can be somewhat effective in at least mitigating the amount of intentional defection that happens if there's, consensus that these goals are ones that we really want to enforce.
Jonathan, would you have anything to add on Arya's question?
No, I think that was a nicely comprehensive answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many directions we could take this in. I mean, one thing that struck me was sort of in the spirit of James Scott, as we've discussed earlier, there is sort of this blind spot, seeing like a state and sort of being trapped within that ontological frame, or to use another sort of analogy, this is the water that we swim in. And when we look at the Amazon and what's occurring there, many Earth system scientists say that the loss of the Amazon is having a direct impact on the aquifers in the US Midwest. It may be having an impact on some of the weather patterns that we're seeing, on the East Coast. It's a possibility. I mean, I'm not expert enough to say, but the point is that there is this sort of planetary context which doesn't seem to be impacting or informing policy making within the most powerful nations, those that could perhaps really accelerate action in this space. And as yet, we do not see a sanctions regime being imposed on Brazil. Perhaps there's an awful lot of activity occurring bilaterally, informally, diplomatic activity, but we're still sort of holding our breath. And I mean, another aspect to this, and perhaps related to the context of the poly crisis, for lack of a better word, is the kind of the intertemporal dimension that we need to act, possibly 20 years ago, but certainly within the next 20 years, to prevent what is likely to be a catastrophe. And then, we have to hope, as Nils is suggesting, that catastrophe is containable, which is a wager, which unfortunately we seem to be. This is the wager that we're making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that notion of sovereignty that says, say, Brazil gets, can do what they want with the Amazon. And no picking on Brazil here, the saying that the Congo can do what the Congo leaves, for us, that here in the United States we can do whatever the hell we want to do. Really, is it's just a very impoverished, or this notion of sovereignty is predicated on a very impoverished view of the world. The same kind of, I would say, impoverished view that you see in kind of liberal individualism, right? The idea that you have this kind of sovereign individual, this sovereign nation that is just, atomized on its own, fully independent. And they just don't recognize this view, or the reality of interdependence, which really is true for individuals, and true for nation states, because we live on this single planet that is interconnected, where things like, if you spoil the Amazon, you'll have effects on, weather on the East Coast, or whatever it is. If the West Antarctic ice sheet melts, you have, that's going to have ramifications everywhere, not just in that one place. Excuse me. So we're really running up against this kind of codified assumption of atomized independence is really starting to push up against and create a lot of problems in the reality of really ontological interdependence. And I would say it's obviously, it's no surprise that sovereignty and this idea of kind of the individual, right? I mean, are both products of basically the same time and place, early modern Europe, and kind of both of these assumptions are really pushing up, at their limits as we speak. And I think more and more people are coming to realize that they're not satisfactory models for acting in the world.
Nils, would you like to offer any reflection on that reflection?
I think that's also well said.
I mean, we're rolling to a close. I mean, actually, I would be curious just to ask this idea of the polycrisis. Are you a fan of this term? And, does it is that a helpful context to think about the planetary within your own framing?
I mean, I think that the polycrisis, Adam Tooze, I guess, is the person who popularized that term maybe 3 years ago now. And I think it's useful in the sense that it underscores the way in which a variety of different crises are deeply interconnected and are mutually reinforcing each other in a kind of series of vicious circles or vicious cycles, right? And Adam Tooze, of course, is most well known as the kind of leading chronicler of the global financial crisis and its aftermath. And so he sort of comes from a perspective that starts with the human-centric thing. The global financial crisis was a quintessentially global anthropocentric event. It was not something that emerged out of other things, but then it ramified into all sorts of other areas. And I think it is useful in the sense that it emphasizes interconnection between different levels. I'm not sure necessarily, there's nothing incompatible with the idea of the polycrisis with the planetary or the condition of planetarity, but I think it unfolds at a kind of different level of argumentation than the one that John and I are really emphasizing. I do think one other thing that is perhaps helpful in a intellectual way for us with that concept is that it emphasizes that effective solutions are going to have to unfold in multiple different domains simultaneously. We need to rethink our financial architectures. We need to rethink our governance architectures. We need to rethink our energy infrastructures. We need to rethink our security models. All of these things need to be rethought at once. I believe strongly that we are kind of at an inflection point right now where the kind of categories we use to organize and to make sense of the world particularly in the sort of years between the 1970s and the global financial crisis are no longer working. And we need a whole new set of vocabularies. And, us emphasizing the planetary is one part of that story that I think is unfolding, as you were saying earlier, Tom, in a whole series of different domains: the scientific, the social scientific, the arts, practical matters in business and in government and governance and administration. All of these things are need to be rethought. People know they need to be rethought. People know the systems aren't working. And I believe that when you are at these moments of paradigm shifts, a lot of things come up for grabs simultaneously. One of the things the sort of subplots in our book is that the 1970s were the last such moment, right? And a lot of possibilities emerged, possible futures emerged in the 1970s and were proposed in the 1970s. Different kinds of language were proposed about, environmentalism and deep ecology. And what ended up getting consolidated was what is now referred to as neoliberalism, right? I don't always love that term, but it's a shorthand for a particular set of solutions which unfolded across a whole bunch of different dimensions, right? About the way business was organized, banking and international finance was organized, trade was organized, individual governments were organized, relationship between state and society was organized. A whole series of rearrangements took place in the 1970s and unfolded in the 1980s across not just the West, but also in the Eastern Bloc and in China and so on. Previous moment to that was obviously the 1940s, catalyzed by the war, right, where a whole new set of institutions were put into place, most notably the United Nations, Security Council, and so on, that were major, major shifts. I believe we're at a moment like the 1940s or the 1970s and early 80s, where there's a whole series of shifts that are taking place simultaneously. And we don't know how that's going to play out, but we're hoping with this book that we can help shape the direction of that change.
It's an exciting time to be doing this work. Yeah, shoulder to the wheel. Obviously, it's also somewhat daunting. I actually have a copy of Richard Falk's original 1972 text, "This Endangered Planet," and I've had the honor of having Richard Falk actually on this podcast to discuss these issues. And part of what we're doing here on the platform is also a kind of a work of recovery, because as you say, there were paradigmatic important debates around the planetary, around global governance, which frankly had a much more radical connotation back in the 1970s. So, part of the conversation is sort of picking up where they left off, but also it is 2024. So, what should we or might we salvage from those earlier debates? And then how do we innovate and pioneer on from where we are?
And of course,
current situation.
An important context of that debate going on kind of in the what's called the planetary 1970s, where there were these debates of Falk and Dubose and Ward and the book Only One Earth and things were going on. This is immediately after what we write about in the book is the consolidation of the nation state as the global institution, that the form of governance that had just consolidated its kind of hegemony around the world as the basically only way to organize governance, which until then had not been the case, right? Up until the 1960s, huge swaths of the world, huge amounts of the global population were governed by empires and other kind of little forms of governance. And as the process of decolonization unfolds, and over time, by basically the mid-60s, it becomes clear that decolonization is a process of nation building. It's a process of building nation states in the wake of empire, as opposed to kind of other alternatives that were proposed that we discussed in the first chapter of the book. That's when people start thinking, okay, wait a minute, now that the world has been closed off and kind of enclosed in kind of the original like the British enclosure movement, right? Like once you kind of take away these commons and seal them all up behind fences, suddenly you start to realize, wait a minute, there are these problems that actually don't fit into that regime. And I think, we're at another similar moment where we're starting to kind of see that all these the big problems that we're facing, climate change, obviously most notably, but certainly not the only one. There's a lot of discussion of the global biodiversity crisis, the sixth great mass extinction. We have COP16 coming up shortly in Colombia. Not the UNFCCC's COP, but the biodiversity COP. These issues are really pressing up, and we're seeing more and more that the institutional architecture that we have, building from the nation state, and then the nation state voluntarily giving some power to the UN system, voluntarily giving some power to local systems, really, or to local governance institutions, just isn't fit for the problems that we have, which on the one hand are planetary in scale, the drivers of which, whether it's pumping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which then operates at the scale of the atmosphere, but then the way it impacts populations, impacts ecosystems, is how these planetary scale processes affect communities, and that has to do with local topography, local geography, local socioeconomic systems, etc. And that kind of holding sovereignty and authority at these at the centralized level, that we kind of look at a map of the world and we can see, okay, there are 193 little shapes that all have their own color with a star for the capital, and there it is, Tom, right behind you on the map. This system just doesn't make sense anymore, right? When we're talking about the carbon cycle as the problem, when we're talking about the nitrogen cycle, when we're talking about whatever else it is. So we appear to be again at this inflection point, and we'll see. The 1970s, the question was on the table, and unfortunately, I think from my point of view, we took the wrong turn. So we'll see what happens this time.
I should really have Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion world map here as well, right?
Exactly.
I've been meaning to try and get a copy of that. Yeah. Well, okay. So, thank you so much for your time, both of you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I am going to give the last word to Kat, or the last question.
I mean, I guess if no one has anything else to add, I'll just sort of close on these final questions. So what advice would you offer to the young people like myself who are grappling with the weight of these planetary crises? And then just following on from that, how can they navigate the uncertainty and find purpose in a world that seems so increasingly chaotic?
Yeah, well, good luck. No. No, I mean, look, just being engaged in these conversations now. I mean, you guys are obviously all enrolled in this program because you're interested in these issues and presumably want to kind of go on and work in this field, which is great. I mean, kind of absorbing the range of issues that I know you're getting, not just from our book, but I know Tom exposes you to like a lot of wide range of exciting new paradigms, new ways of thinking about these problems is exactly what we need, is that kind of the next generation of political leaders and thinkers and international bureaucrats, which I use is a term of honor, not come with these new ideas and push to kind of to shift things. I mean, I think that's really at this point the best thing that kind of we as individuals can be doing. I think the sad reality, as we all know from the long history of international governance, is that the big reforms, the big changes come in the wake of crises. Again, this goes back to the scenario that Kim Stanley Robinson puts out, the heat wave in India is what in his mind leads to the planetary crisis, planetary governance. So can't rule that out. In fact, I unfortunately think that's probably the most likely way we get to really some radical shift. But in the meantime, there's lots that could be done. Just adopting what we call planetary thinking, starting to think, well, what does this mean for the planet as a whole? And I think more and more people are doing that. I mean, I think a lot of people in the climate change space, this kind of is intuitive to them, even if they don't quite understand the details that we lay out. So anyway, that's what I'd say. In terms of uncertainty, I mean, I struggle with the same thing. So I have two young kids. I myself, living through this world. What do we do with this uncertainty? I don't know.
I mean, we dedicated the book to our children, and I guess another way to frame your question, Katya, is how do you balance realism with hope and not to succumb to despair in the face of the polycrisis and the many burgeoning systemic breakdowns that seem to be, looming on us, if not already breaking over us. And I wonder whether there's a generational shift here. I think that my kids are a little bit older than John's. I'm actually quite hopeful about the generation that is emerging now, Generation Z, if we want to put a label on it. Partly because I think that for you all, and I'll say that, put it that way, this has been a kind of reality that you've always lived with. One of the things that's really hard for older people is to even recognize that the world is undergoing a really radical change. There's a famous line that I think it was the physicist Heisenberg's had back 100 years ago, where he's described scientific progress happening by way of one funeral at a time. And what he meant by that is that older people hold on to their older system thinking. And it's generally younger people who have the boldness to see beyond the existing paradigms and systems that we're sitting inside of. And I look at the younger generations that I see that are in college now, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older. But let's say people who are born, since in this century. And I feel a lot of hope, actually. I think that you all have your heads screwed on a lot straighter than I think the previous generations did. You have a much more realistic sense of the way in which the world, the challenges that we face, and the willingness to think more radically about solutions beyond the existing infrastructure. And so in some sense, when we dedicate this book to our children, we dedicate it to also the readership and the action that I hope all of you will take in the next century. I mean, people your age may well see the 22nd century. I won't, but you guys might. And I think that the solutions that you guys will come up with will be the ones that determine the fate of the Earth.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.